But once, the victory happened in Europe, he was ready to come home. They were ready to bring the troops home from Europe, and they were going to go to the South Pacific, because the war continued on in Japan. And as he was leaving Europe, his office, his sergeant or his lieutenant asked him, "Would you like to become an American citizen?" Because he wasn't a citizen. And he said, "Well, yes." So that's how, and I only learned that a year before he died. Knew my dad for 79, well, he was 79 years old when he died. And that's how I learned how he became an American citizen.
Hello, everyone. With us today, we have Sister Rose, who is also my TT Rose, which is Portuguese for aunt. We call her my TT Rose, and is also my godmother. So pleasure to have you today and to chat with you a little bit about our family history. So I'll go ahead and hand it off to you. Where did we come from and how did we get here now?
Oh, yes, exactly. Well, like all, what people in the United States, though, you and I were both born here, don't realize that we all come from immigrants. Everyone here, the only ones who really were true native to this country are the native people, our indigenous brothers and sisters. And so, I don't know, being the oldest in my family, and being the oldest granddaughter, maybe I took on more responsibility or interest, to who we are and where we came from. So I'll start off with, first of all, my grandparents. My dad's family immigrated here from Portugal. They, from the island of Madeira, we used to say Madeira in Portuguese, from the island of Madeira in 1920. And they came, my dad's sister, my dad was 4 and his sister was 6. And either their mother, it had to be their mother, had an uncle who was coming to the US. And so they came along with him. And as a result, my grandfather was the only one of his family, and they came from a large family in Mexico, Madeira, to come to the United States. And so they were here for many years. They landed in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And some year I hoped to go there. I don't know. I think I didn't realize how big of a Portuguese community there is there from the people who come from Madeira. And because a lot of Portuguese people who are here in California come from the Azores. And so they stayed in New Bedford, Massachusetts for several years until they had enough money. And this is where I don't know the full story. I have to ask my cousin Irene, who's the oldest of us first cousins on the Carvalho side. How is it and why did they come to California? Because they were working, my grandfather was working like in a shoe factory there. And then they made enough money. And I believe they came by train from Massachusetts to California. Now, Dad was only 4, 5, so he didn't remember all those stories. And interesting enough, when you're that young, I don't know how much interest you take in a whole lot of, it's only my generation who's beginning to ask those questions, which is fascinating. And that was a great European movement, the people who were coming from Europe to the United States. And so they came across and they eventually ended up in Bright, California. When you think of where Bright, California is in New Bedford, Massachusetts, it's night and day when it comes to, distance. But there were other Madeiran people who were also in Bright. And I think, the neighbors, kept in touch with one another, through their mailings from home. But I also learned, and this is interesting, backing up a bit, when I went to Ireland, there was in Cork, there was a museum, and because these people didn't come first class. More than likely, if you've seen the Titanic, you saw where the people were in the bottom lower decks of the ships, the cattle area. And more than likely, that's probably how they came. And in Ireland, it showed a movie, and it had the sounds of the immigrants who were crossing from Ireland to the United States. And they, while they were on the seas, the storms, and you'd hear the people screaming because of all the tossing and the turning of the ships. I remember that happened. I was in Ireland 14 years ago, and that has never left me. And there, of course, there's no one around now to ask, our grandparents and others, except for I could ask Irene, I guess she might know something, that the trauma just to cross the ocean and to be on the cattle lower deck. So, immigrants, and I don't believe all the family know all this. This is why I always said to my students and to you, travel while you're young, because you learn so much and it changes your heart and being to the whole world, okay, that we're truly all brothers and sisters. So so they landed in New Bedford, stayed there several years, and then made enough money to come out west, and then settled in Bright. And Dad went to school here in Bright up until the 8th grade. School was different. And when they started school, they didn't know English. And so they were always put in the back of the classroom or given a hard time. And they eventually learned English. But it wasn't a pleasant experience for them. And I guess he and his buddies were eating, used to call them polyseeds. Oh gollies, my brain's gone blank. Those black seeds? They're not polyseeds. We sometimes feed them to the birds.
Sunflower seeds?
Thank you. Sunflower seeds. How could I forget that? Sunflower seeds. And I guess the boys were eating them and just tossing the shells on the ground and got expelled from school. Can you imagine? That was the greatest harm they did. So he never went back to school. And he was an 8th grader. So then he just went on to work in the fields and the orchards in Bright, because it was all rural area. Then he went on, and so that was, they came over in the 1920s. So that probably went through the 30s. And then of course, as he grew up to be a young man, World War II broke out, and he wasn't drafted. All the men around him, because they took the younger guys first. And I think Dad was in his mid-20s, your grandfather. And he thought, well, all his buddies were gone. I mean, they literally, took all the young men from the area. He says, why am I staying here? So he volunteered, and he was part of the group for World War II, and part of the group that landed in Normandy on D-Day. And it wasn't until a year before he died that I learned that's because I remember asking him, it was the 50th anniversary. He said, Dad, where were you that day? And he said, there. I said, what? He said, I was there. He says, everybody talks about the first wave of troops that went in to Normandy, and they were all slaughtered. Every one of them were killed. He says, we were the second wave, and we went in, and we had to wade through the blood and the bodies of our buddies, and the fire, the shooting was still going on. And I can't even imagine that kind of trauma, later on in years later, I figured out, he had PTSD, but they didn't have a name for it, But once, the victory happened in Europe, he was ready to come home. They were ready to bring the troops home from Europe, and they were going to go to the South Pacific, because the war continued on in Japan. And as he was leaving Europe, his sergeant or his lieutenant asked him, "Would you like to become an American citizen?" Because he wasn't a citizen. And he said, "Well, yes." So that's how, and I only learned that a year before he died. Knew my dad for 79, well, he was 79 years old when he died. And that's how I learned how he became an American citizen. And that's how many young people today who've come from other countries here have become citizens. They have volunteered to go to Afghanistan and Iraq and all these places, and risking their lives for this country. And aren't they not entitled to become US citizens? At least in my eyes, So so that's Dad's story. Now Mom, she was born here in the United States. Both her parents came from the opposite side of the island that Dad's family were. They came from Portugal, also on the island of Madeira, which is very, it's interesting how they both met here later on in years. But to this day, Gabby, I don't know the story how they really met. I thought, people say, "Oh, how did you meet? How did you get?" They never talked about those things. Now, they were always shy, anything that had to do with those kind of deep emotions, they were. So I've been learning them through the years as I've been growing up. So Mom's family came, and they immigrated. They came through New York, through Ellis Island, and they came with my grandmother's, your great grandmother's uncle, and they weren't married. My grandmother and grandfather, they came with the uncle. And Mom always used to tell the story that we don't know anything about our great grandfather. I don't know what happened to him, or if our grandmother was a widow. And because my grandmother never talked about her father, but again, in those days, it was survival. So, talking about the old countries, they had to let go of so much. They never talked about it. They land here and they don't speak the language. They end up in their little small boroughs of little Portugal or little Italy or little Mexico, because people spoke the same language and had the same culture and faith. So they landed here in April of 1920. I'm not sure the month that Dad's family, but it was right around the same time in two different places. So Mom's parents landed in New York, but their uncle lived in Rhode Island. And I've been privileged enough to go to Rhode Island, and I literally met my grandmother's first cousin there. She thought I was my grandmother. She kept calling me, Maria. I says, no, I'm her granddaughter. It was, and right across, they used to talk about it. Her uncle, they lived above, in those years, their homes were above their stores, their tiendas that they would, had in the little corner markets. And across the street was the Catholic Church. And so they landed here in April. Va's birthday was in May. I think it's May 20th, my grandmother. And then they got married that following October. And I think my grandmother, she came here at 14, married at 15. And my grandfather was about 21 or so. I can't, and it was a matched marriage. My mom always used to say, she thought that her grandmother really liked who my grandfather was, and that they would get married. But instead, he asked my great grandmother for the hand of my grandmother. And so that was the last time my grandmother at the age of 14 ever saw her mother. I mean, I can't even imagine that, saying goodbye. You don't even know your father and you're going to a foreign land. And, I don't know that our Va even went to school, Gabby, because she never learned to read and write here in English. And that's what so many of the family do not realize. She came here at 14, 15 got married, and by the time she was 16 had her first child. And they made enough money again to come west. Now they were very good friends with the Sequeiras because they were first cousins. And so they all came west together. Now my grandfather had two brothers out here. Dominguez, who was working for a dairy farmer, and then his brother John, who also was working for a dairy farmer, and so invited my grandfather Frank to come with them, and they would be dairy farmers. The other piece that Mom used to say is that they were waiting for visas in Madeira, and that the visa for the United States came today, and they plans they were leaving, as soon as the visa came. And the day after they left, he also had visas for South Africa because he had a brother in South Africa. An uncle, great uncle we never met, or mom never met either. So could have also ended up in South Africa. So, when you think of how life, God is in all of this. I can't even imagine being in South Africa, Gabby, and we would have lived through the apartheid and all that. And it's enough living here. So I've always carried those tales with me and the struggles. I can't even imagine my grandmother. And then so she had one child after another. They were living in Crow's Landing. And my grandmother had her first son was Manuel, and he was probably about 3 years old. And then came Uncle Frank. I think you met Uncle Frank. He was probably about a year and a half, and Va was pregnant with Mom, your grandmother. And she always used to have the guys would come in from the fields, and she would, feed them lunch, and, and then she would, always remember to lock the door so the babies, the little ones, wouldn't get out. Well, this one day, she was, probably putting, I think, Uncle Frank to bed, and Manuel got out, and he ended up, I guess there were ditches just across, from where they lived in their little house. I have pictures of the houses where they, their little shacks, but it was something, it was where they lived. It was their home. So, and drowned. And so my grandmother noticed that he was missing, and she went looking, and I guess the guys were in the fields, but heard her screeching and came looking, and they knew right away. Little babies are attracted to water. And sure enough, he fell into the ditch and drowned. And when I think of it, Mom, my grandmother was carrying Mom at the time. So that again was a pretty traumatic. And Va must have been about 17. This is her third child. She's pregnant, and this happens. So, and then time went on. She had more children. She had lost another little one, George. I think he was a preemie. He was very, after a young body can only do so much, and I'm not sure where he came in, because after Mom came Teacher Rosie, and then it could have been George, and then Uncle Joaquin, and then Uncle John. Uncle John was a preemie too, and so was Titi Connie. So yeah, I mean, there was only so much, and I'm probably about the same height as is my va. I'm the shortest in the family, and she wasn't tall. So I'm the short, squatty Portuguese person that I inherited that gene. But you know, she was a beautiful lady. They were always people of great faith. I remember her coming up to visit, and we would say our prayers together in bed. And you know, she spoke very broken English. She never learned to read or write. But and I don't know if she had really opportunity in the Patterson, you know, that area, because things were a little bit more rural there as they began to grow up here in the northern area of Sacramento, the capital, and some of the school districts. And so some of the people who came from Portugal and other countries began to go to school. And I remember Mrs. Sequeira, who's our cousin, started to go to night school, and that's how she learned English and learned how to read and write a bit, you know. And I remember and that's probably what touched me about being a teacher. You know, here I was in admiration. I was just a young girl watching these who knew the language here, English, and these people were going to school as adults, trying to learn a language. And I was amazed. I mean, I was just always amazed, you know, that after a long day's work, feeding their family, you know, getting dinner, because the women just worked at home, and they worked hard at home. They did everything, and that she made a time to go to school. What our grandmother did after she raised all her kids and they were out of the house, Va decided to learn how to do some fun things. She learned how to swim. She would take swimming lessons and would learn how to swim. And she did some other fun things like that for herself, which I think amazing when you think, Mom, your grandmother was afraid of water. And here her mother in her later years, in her 50s, learned how to swim. So they were, you know, immigrants are I just marvel at them. And you go back to scripture, and I was looking up at some of the scripture passages this morning. Let me see, I had them here, downloaded them. My other email, I couldn't print them off because I couldn't get on, but you know, it has, because all of us, you know, and this is in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, God speaking to the people, he said, you shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You know, they were outcasts. They were strangers. And so in turn, you're asked to welcome the stranger. And in New Testament scripture, it says, you have heard it said, this is from Matthew, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. That means anyone who's a foreigner or an alien. But I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. And, you know, those of us who persecute the immigrant, I can't even imagine that. You know, seeing somebody I don't know, why do I want to be mean to them? I don't know them. They're a human being. They bleed like me. And Matthew says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Truly, I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of my brothers and sisters' children, you did it to me. I mean, that's right out of scripture. You know, it has nothing to do with constitutions and anything else, politics. It comes right from the very heart of who we are as human beings. So I've always had it in me that I wanted to be a teacher or a nurse. And I always wanted to, being the oldest, I did everything at home. So, but I knew that I wanted to be more than a domestic woman. I wanted to be an educated woman. I had no problems with, you know, running a household, but I also wanted to be educated and reach out to other people. So that's, that has always been with me. And I didn't, you know, it's probably because of who I was surrounded with. So questions. I probably have left some things out, Gabby, but
Yeah, I know we're running a little over, but yeah, thank you for sharing your story. And I mean, I learned a whole lot about my family origins today too. And I can tell that a lot of, our family history has helped, turned you into the woman that you are today. And, with all of your inspiration to be a teacher and to help others.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I still have passion for the immigrants at the border. I mean, I spent two and a half years down there, and Lucille spent some time with me. I think that was a growing experience for her too. We were in the colonias. It was different than when we went to Belize. Years prior to Belize, other years we were with, the poor ones. But in Texas, it was just, they were right there in your face, right there on the border. And it's gotten even worse right now because of all the immigrants that are coming, and then the pandemic. But right now I have a ministry that's keeping me tied up. So I won't be going to the border anytime soon again. But at least I have it in my heart, and I keep in touch with the people I've met there. So we still stay in touch. So my heart's there.